so that the Earth appears to be much further away than it actually was. The lights are turned out within the spacecraft, making the space within the spacecraft indistinguishable from the space outside the spacecraft surrounding the Earth. Sibrel believes Apollo 11 was in a low Earth orbit for the duration of the mission, and these shots were being made by the astronauts to possibly be used to convince the public that Apollo 11 was on its journey to the moon. The final shot shows Michael Collins with the Earth outside the window looking very large, indicating Apollo 11 probably was in a low Earth orbit at this time.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
Okay, Roger, we're coming in on Earth.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light. And we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow. We can see the oceans with a definite blue cast, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
Roger, the ATC is working real well. The F-22 looks good. Over. Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, did you copy? Over.
Roger, we copied that, Charlie.
Roger, your transmissions the last couple of times have been about 2 by. Over.
Okay, how do you read me now?
Right, you're 5 by now.
Coastline.
Now we're coming in. Can't quite make out who that is.
What is your proposition that we didn't go to the moon?
In effect, the interview ended when the interviewer betrayed the subject by his silence. It now turns into a challenge and the opportunity is lost.
I know for a fact that you did.
This is a critical mistake on top of a critical mistake. Here, he could have presented the topic as doubt, not as for fact, which technically weakens the assertion while increasing the challenge personally to the subject. This challenge, which should have been avoided, was not expected by the subject. Journalists seek information by trade, not press narrative. This is how to lose a subject.
I know for a fact that you did not.
You know for a fact that we did not.
The topic is very sensitive to our subject. In parroting back the words, A, the subject retorts in question form, and B, changes the pronoun you to we in the answer. This suggests that the defensive posture is not only high, but it is now something in which the subject does not wish to be alone psychologically with. The subject does not want to be accused of not going by himself, but as a team with others.
That's correct, and you'll see this tape proves that.
Foolishness compounded. The interviewer ended the interview, not the subject and not the topic.
Okay, well, I'm not interested in satisfying your suppositions when there's all this evidence that we did.
This is an unexpected and weak assertion. It goes to evidence. This is a subtle form of distancing language. When one experiences something personally, particularly something that is dramatic or historic, the expected language will always be his personal experience. The subject will not have need for nor interest in evidence. This is the psychological wall of truth that shows itself strongly in language. It is not here.
This proves, as you see, that you were using the window to demonstrate that you were halfway to the moon when you were
Turn the camera off, please. Turn the camera off. You're full of shit.
It is personal. This is why an interviewer must never break trust with the subject. He could have said, I would like to learn, and I would like to write the truth in a book, and I am open to learn about this footage. Instead, he presented it in the form of an accusation. Note that the subject had previously used the pronoun we to describe them. Even though it was in increased tension, it was still unity. The topic did not break the unity. The subject himself did not break the unity.
That you're in Earth orbit. Now, if the moon is 3 days away, and this is late, on the 18th, how could you possibly walk on the moon 2 days later when this was shot on the 18th?
You want me to sit in front of a camera while you're taking pictures, you're showing this, and then you want to see my reaction?
This is a challenge that could have been diffused with honesty. Yes, this way we can learn from you, or anything similar. By repeating the word fact, the interviewer only increases the resistance of the subject.
I know for a fact
That's slimy journalism. Do you realize that?
If
You ought to be ashamed of
If you read the
yourself.
document that I have in here, you'll find that it's not. That this is a personal plea to do what is right.
Virtue signaling is also insulting, which only increases the resistance. This is a very poorly conducted interview. By using personal plea, however, he got the subject's attention, who turns back into his earlier offer.
Well, we sit and we talk about things ahead of time.
Analytical Interviewing Rule 101. Do not interrupt the subject. It is likely that the lack of trust could have been repaired by reviewing the material off camera. This should have been agreed to, as it is disarming and would have allowed the interviewer to get information one way or another. The interviewer shows that he is not interested in the truth, but in pushing his narrative.
Document that you want to see. I know for a fact.
The interviewer's own weakness continues in his repetition of fact.
But what it is you're trying to do is unethical. You don't believe that?
The subject asked the interviewer a question and the interviewer refused to answer. The subject asked the interviewer a second question, of which he was refused. The subject now introduces ethics.
No, I do not.
Well, then we have a difference of opinion.
This is where you're using the window of the spacecraft to appear to be the Earth far away. We got the raw footage of it. We have an auxiliary track, so I'm prompting you when to speak.
You believe in UFOs?
No, I
You
do
believe
not.
we've been visited by... Well, why do
No, I
you want to
don't.
believe this stuff?
The need to ridicule the interviewer suggests the sensitivity of the information. Unfortunately, the interviewer made sure that the sensitivity to the information would not be addressed.
I know for a fact, we've had this analyzed, and this is the window, and and it's dated by an atomic clock at the Goldstone tracking station, which is on the tape.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. Why
You
don't
were
you
there.
talk to the administrator in NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight.
I
We're
know
not...
for
A. Question form is regarding authority. B. Sentence in the present tense is unreliable. C. He was about to tell us in the negative, we are not, but it will not be known because the interviewer interrupted the subject.
I know for a fact that and this tape would prove it in a court of law.
Subsequently, this
It would.
tape was never used.
Why don't
It
you
would.
try? Why don't you put your money into a court of law and see how people laugh at you? You want it...
No one is
Is your
laughing.
camera working?
The subject is concerned about how he will come off on camera. This is the result of not only sensitive information, but broken trust personally. The subject likely is concerned that the journalist who has condemned him will wish to portray him personally as one in guilt.
No one has laughed.
It is likely that the journalist has been laughed at.
And this makes you the real famous person that has discovered this and reveals all this stuff. What an ego you must have to want to propel yourself like this.
The wording used by the subject here, while attempting to insult, reveals sensitivity towards the topic, not only the interviewer. This is why accusations should be made reluctantly, only when absolutely necessary and without morals.
That's not why I'm doing it, and God knows that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for the truth to come out because I think it was wrong.
The self-justification is another mistake for a journalist. This has set up disparity. The journalist knows right from wrong, and the subject is wrong. There is no unity in this, and the information now greatly hindered as it turns personal, to condemn the journalist and defend self. It moves emotion away from the topic, which would have granted the most yield, and towards personal justification. Doing it for the truth is a positive, but because I think it is wrong, whether accurate or not, condemns the subject as the wrongdoer, and pushes him into an even greater defensive posture. This will lead him to defend himself rather than the mission or any details of the mission. The journalist increases the personal pressure, which then causes us to view any sensitive reaction in the same way. One is wrong and has to defend himself. So he is not wrong, but the interviewer is wrong. While this is being done, valuable potential information is lost.
You can also notice how the astronaut
But you're doing it the wrong way. You don't mislead somebody like me to come in here.
The subject addresses the betrayal. Aldrin was told he was wrong and now tells the journalist that the journalist is wrong. Note the self-importance. Somebody like me follows the ridicule of the journalist becoming famous in discovery. We might have gotten some insight into the topic discovered had the journalist not made this personal, good guy versus bad guy. Far better would be to allow the subject to see the material and know what it is about and to decline to discuss it, only to be asked why he had a need not to discuss, including asking, are there any military reasons in some form? By setting up an adversarial relationship, the journalist lost the opportunity.
You didn't go to the moon. That's misleading people. I'm showing you this
Okay,
tape.
we went to the moon. We're not misleading anybody.
This is not a strong assertion because A, it is parroted language, which reduces the element of internal stress if he was being deceptive, and B, it did not use the pronoun I as expected in a most personal historic event. It is unreliable as it stands.
Then how is it possible that this is the window? It's shot to make it look like...
Look, you can manufacture all you want with.
This is a weak accusation, but we cannot conclude it is from the content. This is why making it personal through virtue signaling and condemning the subject loses the opportunity for information, including information gleaned specifically through the lens of statement analysis.
This is straight. This isn't manufactured.
Sure.
You know that it
To
isn't.
that of an interior of the astronauts at work.
I believe this would prove it in a court of law that you did not go to the moon. It's dated on the 18th. It proves when you remove the
Will you
crystal.
give me your
Here's
business
the light.
card?
It's all in there.
Camera controls,
It's all
but
in there.
not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert.
This proves that it's the window. You can see them removing the crescent insert that you did to create the terminator line in front of
You're
the
so
window.
full of shit, I can't believe it.
Earth orbit.
If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
Again, it's personal. So the conclusions are, the journalist did not glean information on the topic due to the fault of the journalist alone. The subject was placed in a personally accusatory defensive posture while being interviewed on a sensitive topic. It was the sensitivity around the topic that would have given us insight. The journalist instead guided the subject to avoid the topic and defend himself and attack the journalist. The lens of statement analysis allows for us to discern not only truth from deception, but content analysis. Had the journalist not made such accusations nor used morally charged language, he would have gotten information from the subject. Whether the subject never went to the moon, or if he did and is not permitted to speak about it from authorities, i.e. military, information could have been gleaned had the journalist remained open and unified with the subject. He did not. In the interview, the subject has the information. Each interruption lost information. Where there is a time for accusation is only at the end of an interview or when the subject refuses to answer. Viewing the subject's use of the pronoun we, the subject was, at the least, willing to speak off camera to learn what would be asked on camera. This would have been valuable information. Even if an agreement was reached before the camera was turned on, the journalist would have allowed for some information to be presented for analysis. The journalist's primary motive, according to his language, was not obtaining information. His repetition of the word fact showed increased sensitivity for the journalist himself. He has likely an acute need here for self-justification that would have been addressed in formal training. As interviewers, we allow subjects to condemn us if they wish, as long as they keep talking about the topic in hand. It is likely that the journalist, due to his own fault and perhaps from being personally accused of holding to a conspiracy theory, felt the need for self-justification and allowed it to overrule his effort to obtain information. The topic is very sensitive to both parties. One showed a strong need for avoidance, while the journalist possesses a strong need to prove his belief. In any interview, the interviewer will get one of two impressions. Either the subject is working with them to facilitate the flow of information, or he is working against the interview to hinder it. Buzz Aldrin began with a defensive posture. He introduced payment, representation, but also the sensitive topic of authority. Our subject was acutely aware of the need, even years later, for official permission to speak freely. This is in fact something that did come out of this interview as part of the analysis conclusion. Aldrin does need permission to freely choose to share information about a mission many years prior. This is evident from his words regarding his fellow astronauts' choice. Why is this? Although money was mentioned, which may go back to an official position where being paid for appearances needed approval, it does not appear strongly linked in the language. Classified information. Information remains classified for many decades. Those with experiential memory of a historical event will have it reflected in their language. If they must conceal the information, regardless of the cause of concealment, it will put them under considerable stress and will show itself in the language. This concealment will often be seen linguistically through a lack of commitment. Passivity, passive voice, as well as skipping over time is expected. This event, whether it was actual or was a military bluff, was a historic event for them. The language will reflect this. The defensive posture of the subject was already high before the journalist raised it to the point of effectively ending the interview. The origin of defensive posture and sensitivity towards the topic itself is not known here. The journalist made this into good guy versus bad guy, which hindered significantly the ability to obtain knowledge. Had the journalist challenged him without virtue signalling, we may have gotten a significant yield from Aldrin's words. For those looking to learn the truth as to whether or not the lunar landing took place, this was a lost opportunity. And interestingly, around that time, that's when Buzz Aldrin punches him in the face, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was, I think when he was going out of the hotel, or maybe the next day when he went back, that's when there's this altercation, and which results in physical violence.
You really like attention, don't you? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Andrew and I have both recently been contacted by Albino Gallipini, who has written a autobiography of Bill Casing.
A biography.
Yeah, because he would have written it himself.
Autobiographies,
right. Yeah. So just, can you give us some information on that, Andrew?
Yes, well, we were contacted because Albino had this information that we talked about this in your lecture tour, that Bill Casing had started work on a film script for a film based around the story of them hoaxing the moon landings. And then at some point he became aware that there was another film script which was in progress, which was actually the Capricorn 1 film script. I think Capricorn 1 was released in 1978, I think. And Albino, I think he got to know Bill Casing's family, and he also got this document which was from one of Bill Casing's lawyers, where he said that they had managed to register a film script about this idea of a fake mission to Mars, but it was actually essentially the same as Bill Casing's film script, but they put a copyright on it, and the copyright predated the filing of any copyright date that Casing had got on his screenplay. And the lawyer had found this out and said, well, whoever's got the power to actually manipulate the dates like this on these filings, I don't really want to mess with those people. I've got a family, so we're just going to have to leave it.
So I explain all this in one of my lectures. I'll put the link on the screen if you want to know what Andrew's talking about. They prevented Bill Casing from making the film that he wanted to make about the moon landings.
That's right.
By copying his script and then changing the story slightly to make it about Mars, and then they made the film, so he couldn't make his film.
That's right. And Albino decided to write this biography of Casing because he was a very unusual chap, and obviously he'd brought all this information out. So I think he was interested in the backdrop to that, and it's now available on Lulu. I did encourage Albino to post it on Amazon as well, but I don't know if, because they have a bigger readership, but I don't know if he's done that as well. But a very interesting man, Bill Casing, and probably worth reading his biography to find out more about what motivated him to disclose the the moon hoax stuff that he knew.
Right, and I'm just going to show another clip from the lecture now where I mentioned Bill Kaysing, because Bill Kaysing was one of the first people who started to suggest that the moon landings may not have happened. And he wrote this very early in his 1970s book, We Never Went to the Moon. So I mentioned that in this next clip. Okay, so what's going on here? If they didn't land Apollo 11 on the moon, did they land 12 or 14 or 15? Because there are 6 missions that NASA claim landed on the moon. Did any of them go? Were they getting a bit nearer each time? Well, let's present some evidence from Apollo 17, the last mission which supposedly landed on the lunar surface. Here are 2 photographs from that mission. If we look at the top one, we've featured this on Rich Planet before, but I think it's important to go through it again. So what we're led to believe here, if you just look at the top image, is that the lunar lander's come down, it's landed on the lunar surface, the astronauts have got out, they've climbed down this ladder, and they've walked towards the camera. One of them's turned around and taken a snapshot of the lunar lander with some hills in the background. They've then continued walking in the same direction, 150 meters. One of them's then started doing a little experiment. The other one turns around and takes a photograph of him with the background. So you can see the lunar lander here in the 2 shots. Now just look at the backdrops. Look how similar they are. Look at Hill B here with this shading on it. What are the chances on Earth if me and you get out of a car and I take a photograph of the car, and then we walk 150 meters down the road and I take a photograph of you with a car in the background? What are the chances of getting an almost identical backdrop, right? Now, a skeptic contacted me and said, no, the backdrops aren't identical if you look very closely. There's slight differences in shadows and things here. Well, if what they tell us is true, that it was front screen projection system that was used, i.e. thousands of tiny beads reflecting an image, perhaps these images were also taken on a different day, you are going to get differences. They're not going to be identical. It's not like compositing a green screen image where the images would be identical. So you would expect slight differences in shadow and that kind of thing, which is exactly what we see. So this is very strong evidence, in my opinion, that these photographs are taken in a studio. People have even worked out the size of this studio. You're talking a huge studio, probably in a hangar of the order of 300 meters to the actual backdrop. So it doesn't look good for NASA. And this doesn't prove that Apollo 17 didn't land. It just proves that they've faked some photographs in a studio, or it's strong evidence that they've faked some photographs in a studio. So I think they're very, very worried about this evidence, the evidence of Apollo 11, the new evidence that I've just showed you, because it doesn't look good for NASA. And that's why we get articles like this one. This appeared in the Metro newspaper last year, titled, "Here's Why the Moon Landings Weren't Faked. New Conspiracy Study Proves It." So they feel the need to deny moon conspiracy theories. So it says, in the wilder reaches of the internet, lots of people still believe that NASA faked the moon landings and possibly even its entire space program. But it's absolute balls, a new study has shown. It would have simply been impossible to keep it a secret, according to Oxford scientists. If the moon landings had been a hoax involving an estimated 411,000 people, it would have been found out in 3 years and 8 months. British physicist Dr. David Grimes worked out a mathematical way to calculate the chances of a plot being deliberately leaked by a whistleblower or accidentally uncovered. Now then, what this shows is that Dr. David Grimes has done no research into what moon hoax researchers claim, right? So if you read one of the earliest books by Bill Kaysing, written in the 1970s, called We Never Went to the Moon, he explains that the whole thing was done without informing all of NASA. In fact, only informing a tiny handful of people. It's all in his book. So why hasn't Dr. Grimes looked at this book? So in Bill Kaysing's book, Bill Kaysing was a technologist. He worked on some of the Apollo technology. He explains, yes, there was a visible NASA Apollo program, but there was also another secret project called the ASP, the Apollo Simulation Project. This is all in Bill Kaysing's book. And he claims that they had a secret base in Nevada, so a considerable sum of money spent on this group that was used to hoax the mission, between $4 and $7 billion. But even that group, even the secret group that was hoaxing the mission, was being ran to Manhattan Project style rules. So only a few people underneath actually knew what was going on. So the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, only 6 people knew what they were doing. And Bill Kaysing claims that with the hoaxed moon landings, it was the same. So let me give you a little example. In my career as an engineer, the company I worked for used to build these things. This is a generator in a power station, produces the electricity that comes in your home. So I worked for a company called NEI that used to build these. And I worked in the control systems department. So when you have a huge generator like this, you have a rack of electronics called an AVR, automatic voltage regulator, which would look something like that. And it's controlling all aspects of that generator, the voltage and the frequencies and that kind of thing. Now, what you do not do is build your control system and just plug it in and expect it to work, because these cost millions of pounds to build. So what you do is you build a simulator. So it's a box of electronics which will emulate in every respect that piece of hardware, that 500 megawatt generator. And in my time at NEI, this is one of the projects that I was involved with. There's the specifications, Richard. There's an electronics lab. Go ahead and build the generator simulator. So once that's built, the AVR, the control system, is then plugged into it and then is used. So the simulator is used to test and debug the control system. So you know that it's all working correctly because you've proved it with a simulator. And only then do you take it to your power station and then you know it's going to work. So the point I'm making is that simulators are a very important part in engineering. They're used all over the place. I've worked on 2 or 3 different simulator projects in my time as an engineer. Now, if you consider the control desks at NASA for these various Apollo missions, some of these desks might be just monitoring things on the mission. Others might be actually sending data to the mission and controlling things. So all this technology would need to be tested. You wouldn't just build these desks and then use it live on a mission. You would build a simulator. So that simulator would simulate everything in the Apollo rocket, and it would simulate all of the communication data. Now that simulator might be in the same room. It could be in a different city because it's a comms simulator. But the point is, engineers would be tasked to build a simulator to test the control room. Now, those guys would not be told, hey, we're going to use this to fake the mission. But that technology that they built could well be. So the same applies to the sets. They wouldn't, if they're building these 300-meter sets with their front screen projection systems, right? They're not going to tell all the guys building them what they're for. Well, we're hoaxing the mission, lads. Come on, we put the front screen projection up. That's not how they work. They're told, well, this is for publicity. Okay? So that's how it works. And it's all explained in Bill Kaysing's 1970s book, We Never Went to the Moon. So as I say, Dr. David Grimes has done no work, no research. So I wrote to Dr. David Grimes to tell him this, and I didn't get a reply. So I explained to him what I've just explained to you, and I sent him a link to this book, little booklet that I've written all about Mars. Because as you may know, you may have seen some of the programs on Rich Planet. I've been working on this for a number of years now, and I'm fairly convinced now. It is a hypothesis, so I wouldn't stake my life on it, right? But I'm fairly convinced that none of the rovers and landers that they say they've sent to Mars landed on the Martian surface. I've challenged anyone to read this book and then after it think that they're on Mars. And in my opinion, it's been done in a very similar fashion to how they did it with Apollo, where all these guys here who really did build a rover and they really did send it to the rocket, etc., but it never went to Mars. But all these guys believe it is on Mars. That's how the conspiracies are run, in my opinion. And I communicated with this guy, Robert Manning, senior engineer on the Curiosity project, and he agreed to answer any technical question that I put to him. So Andrew Johnson and myself, we drafted up 26 questions, and he answered one question and ran away from the rest. So if you want to read all of those questions and the emails that I've shared with Robert Manning, it's all in that book. And you can decide for yourself whether you think they're lying or not. Okay, and just this Sunday just gone, I noticed I was filling my van up with petrol on the way here, and this is the front page of the Sunday Times. After I've just presented this new Peter Hyatt research, yeah? Front page of the Times, the last men on the moon win 2 tickets to see the astronauts. Is that a coincidence? Makes you laugh. So I'd like now to add some additional information that I've recorded after the talk. I just want to bring people's attention to this film, Operation Avalanche, because in my opinion it's a very clever piece of disinformation. The film itself follows a group of CIA operatives who are spying on NASA, and they accidentally discover that NASA, or a small part within NASA, is planning to fake the moon landings. Now, in my opinion, this film speaks to two distinct audiences. The first audience that it speaks to is the audience that already believe the moon landings were faked. And what I think the messages that it's trying to put out to that group is that if the moon landings were faked, then it wasn't authorized. You can't blame the government or NASA or the CIA or intelligence agencies. It was a renegade group within NASA that nobody had control of. So it's trying to dispel any blame from the current system. The second group that I think this film is speaking to is the larger group which just believe the moon landings happened as they were reported. Now, in this film, there's much evidence that moon hoax researchers put forward is covered. So the Stanley Kubrick front screen projection is mentioned, the famous sea rock is mentioned, and many, many other pieces of evidence is mentioned in this film. So it's as if they're trying to mop up all of the evidence that moon hoax researchers have come forward with in order to debunk the moon landings, and they've put it in this film to present it in a slightly wacky way to people who believe the moon landings were real. So if those people then encounter that evidence at a later date, they're more likely to dismiss it because they've seen it in this wacky film. So that's what I think this film is up to, a very clever piece of disinformation. I'm going to read some comments now from Wikipedia about NASA. Just to point out, I don't read from Wikipedia because it represents truth. I read from Wikipedia because it represents the official narrative. It represents what NASA has told the public. So this is the first comment I want to draw people's attention to. Apollo set major milestones in human spaceflight. It stands alone in sending manned missions beyond low Earth orbit and landing humans on another celestial body. So just consider that. Nobody else, no country, no organization other than the Apollo moon missions have sent anyone beyond low Earth orbit. Now, if you consider the evidence that I've just presented, it's quite possible that those Apollo moon missions did not go beyond low Earth orbit. So what this is telling me, at least in the white world, the acknowledged space projects, possibly none of them have gone beyond low Earth orbit. Here's another quote from Wikipedia. The first manned flight of Orion, that's the new rocket that they're developing, and SLA, Exploration Mission 2, EM2, is to launch between 2019 and 2021. It is a 10 to 14 day mission planned to place a crew of 4 into lunar orbit. So it's going to take them till 2020 just to get a man to orbit the moon. Now, according to NASA, there were 8 missions in the 1960s which orbited the moon with men in the spacecraft. That was 50 years ago. So why is it taking them up until 2020 to do the same? In my opinion, this is more evidence that those 1960s missions probably did not go anywhere near the moon. Here's another quote. On December the 4th, 2006, NASA announced it was planning a permanent moon base. The goal was to start building the moon base by 2020 and by 2024 have a fully functional base. In 2010, President Barack Obama halted existing plans, including the moon base, and directed focus on manned missions to asteroids and Mars, as well as extending support for the International Space Station. So that's very, very unusual. What he's done, he's cancelled this moon project and replaced it with much more far-fetched or much more difficult projects, landing someone on an asteroid or on Mars. So again, I think this could be evidence that we haven't been, at least in the white world, we haven't been beyond low Earth orbit. And that brings about the question, is there some sort of constraint? Now, I've spoken about NASA, and I would suggest that NASA's projects some of them are fraudulent, not all of them. I think some of the unmanned projects have been real. I think the space shuttle was real. I think the International Space Station is real. But I'm very doubtful about whether Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and I'm very doubtful about whether any of the Mars rover missions are real. So NASA's running frauds, in my opinion. So it's possible then that at least white world projects have never left low Earth orbit, as I've suggested there. And we're going to look at some more evidence from Apollo missions now, Andrew. And
yes.
So we wanted to talk about the rocks first, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I'll just mention, following on from the Bill Kaysing thing, just a couple of little things. You can probably get hold of Bill Kaysing's book, We Never Went to the Moon, fairly easily. And I think there are various downloads of it available, as well as obviously paper copies. Same thing with Ralph Renee's book, which I recommend for people, which is NASA Mooned America. I had a couple of people writing to me about, for example, problems that would appear in the Apollo films with pressurization of the spacesuits, that they would inflate like a Michelin Man type of thing. And a lot of that is covered in Ralph Renee's book, and this chap that wrote to me hadn't realised that. So again, people that are thinking of those things now and thinking, hang on, what about this, what about that? I suggest that they read Ralph Renee's book and watch as many of the videos that are available, such as the one on David Percy's website, orlis.com, because you may find that a lot of that stuff is already covered in there. It's just that you were not yet aware of it.
Right. Now, one website that I would recommend is Jarrah White's website. Just tell us about him, Andrew.
Yes, and that was sort of logic follows on that Jarrah White is he's younger than us. I'm not quite sure how old he is. He describes himself as the grandson of the moon hoax or something, and he did get to know Ralph Renee before he died. And I think Jarrah White is now, he's selling copies of Ralph Renee's book. And Jarrah White has done many videos on the Apollo hoax, many different aspects. I did a broadcast with him 3 or 4 years ago with Morgan Reynolds, Dr. Morgan Reynolds, who also, doesn't, he's sure like we are that they didn't go to the moon with the Apollo craft. And Jarrah White has done many useful videos, one of which we're going to discuss today, where he goes through a lot of the scientific data for various aspects of the missions. And one particular one that just come to my mind is about this account of the Russian Mir space station, where they put a Russian flag, outside the space station on one of the spacewalks that they did. And then there was another comment made on a later mission where they said, well, we need to go and retrieve the flag because it's going to get in the way of this new equipment or something. And then the other cosmonaut says, no, don't bother, there's nothing left of it. It's all been dissolved away by micrometeoroids and stuff. And Jarrah White made a point of discussing this because NASA had claimed that they could still see evidence of the flag on the moon that the Apollo crew had left there after 40 years. But this other flag on the Mir space station, I think, had only been in space for about 18 months before there was just basically nothing left of it. And so he was making this comparison. You can watch the video about that.
His channel is called Moon Faker. And as you say, he's made hours and hours and hours of videos.
And he's had many
challenging the moon missions. Yeah. And people who are connected to NASA have tried to challenge him, haven't they? Or they've tried to discredit him in different ways.
Yes, and he's had many sort of DMCA attacks on his channel, people filing spurious copyright claims, and all the Apollo films are in the public domain anyway, and that sort of thing.
Right, so let's just touch on one of the things that he's covered, which is the, it's the Chinese mission. So in 2013, China sent a rover to the moon, which was unmanned, and it had hardware on it which could collect samples of the soil and then analyze those samples using an X-ray spectrometer, and it then sent the data back through a radio comms link.
Yes.
And produced a graph which has been published by the Chinese. It's I'll just put the graph up on the screen. It's probably not going to mean a lot to most viewers, but this is an X-ray spectroscopy graph, and what you can derive from that is the percentage composition for all of the different chemical elements, so such as magnesium, aluminium, silicon, potassium, calcium, titanium, chromium, etc., etc. So you really would need to watch the video to work out how Jarrah White has because he has a scientific background in geology, doesn't he?
I think something like that. Yes, yes.
And how he's from this spectroscopy graph, he's worked out the percentages of the various different elements.
Yes, and this video is called a Chinese road trip. I'm sure you.
So it's Moon Faker Chinese road trip. So you'd need to watch that to get the full details.
And you probably need to watch it twice as well because it's very, very dense with details.
Right. Now, the rocks that the Apollo missions allegedly brought back, I can put this graphic up from Jarrah White's video. This shows a picture of the moon, and the numbers there, 12, 14, 16, denote the various Apollo missions. So we've got Apollo 12 there, Apollo 14, 16, 11, 17. So this is where Apollo allegedly landed on the moon, the various sites. And the white arrow there we can see, this is where the Chinese rover landed and took samples in that area. Now, the rocks that supposedly came back from the moon, you can get scientific data which has all been published on the chemical composition of those rocks. And the makeup of those rocks is very similar from the 6 Apollo sites, as he describes in the film. Right? But what Jarrah White has then done is compared the Chinese results with the published results that NASA have put out on the rocks. And what he finds is that someone's lying.
Yeah.
Someone's lying.
Yeah.
So let's just look at magnesium. Like I say, in order to get the full reference and the reasoning or how these graphs have been derived, you need to watch the video. But we've got magnesium here. We see on the right-hand side there, that's the Chang'e 3, the Chinese mission, 0.2% for magnesium. And we've got all of the Apollo missions, Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, much, much higher. And we can just zip through the various different elements. Aluminium, again, Chang'e 3, much, much lower in aluminium. Silicon. Potassium, no anomaly there. So Apollo 14, the rocks there had a slightly higher potassium content than the rest of the Apollo missions. So there's no real anomaly there with potassium. Calcium, titanium, chromium, iron, again, no anomaly with iron. Strontium, yttrium, and zirconium. So the rocks that China have analysed are totally different, different in almost every way to what NASA have allegedly brought back from the moon. And I think Jarrah White suggests that the ones that Apollo claim to be from the moon, they're just from some remote part of the Earth, probably. That's what he suggests.
Yeah, I think he makes some comparisons to certain Earth geology to draw that conclusion. It is a very detailed video and very, very well done. I'm not sure it's something I'd be capable of making, but I recommend people watch it and decide what they think is going on.
Right. And just as an aside with regards Buzz Aldrin, Andrew sent me a video of Donald Trump doing some sort of presentation because allegedly Trump is relaunching some certain space missions, and they had this gathering at the White House or wherever it was, and Buzz Aldrin was there. Just tell us about it, Andrew.
Yeah, so I think somebody's taken a portion of this video and then just zoomed in on Buzz Aldrin's face, and the camera is fixed on Aldrin's face whilst Trump is speaking, so you can hear Trump's voice in the background, and then you can see Buzz Aldrin, who becomes a kind of like a rubber-faced alien or something. It's rather uncomfortable to watch, actually. But
I think it's probably not fair to draw too much into it because of his age.
Yes,
he might have a bit of Alzheimer's or something like that. He is a very old guy now. I mean, not in 2004 when he was being interviewed by Bart Zabel. He was compass mentis then, but he is a very old guy now. Yeah. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that one, although it is very weird to watch. Now, you've got some more moon evidence you wanted to...
Well, there's just a few things I think that are probably worth adding, which have, again, more recent ones that have come up. The first one is this clip of Don Pettit, who's this NASA astronaut who basically will play the clip. It's very, very short. And this was released in an IB Times video, which I think was a collation of little sound bites from people that work at ESA, the European Space Agency, and a few other people. One of whom was this Don Pettit character who says that they've destroyed the technology that took them to the moon.
Well, let's have a look at that then.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
They just chucked it in the skip then, or?
Well, you know, apparently maybe they had a ritual burning once, you know...
along with all the drawings?
All the drawings and the tapes and everything. Once Edgar Mitchell had come back from... oh, not Edgar Mitchell, he wasn't the last one, but the last 1972 Apollo 17 had finished, you know.
Right. And you wanted to mention... Was it Apollo 17 where there's an astronaut gets out halfway back to the Earth?
Yes, there's this clip that Neil sent me, Neil Geddes-Ward sent me about a year or so ago, maybe longer. Very interesting clip where the story goes that on the way back from the moon, Apollo 17, they needed to retrieve something from outside the command module. So one of them, and there's a video of this in the NASA archives, gets out, puts his, you know, the spacesuit is on, and they go out of the capsule and onto the craft to retrieve some tapes or something, some you know, seismic tapes from an instrument or something. I don't know why they need to be retrieved from outside the craft, but that's the story that you get if you read the journal, because they have a log of all the missions, and every minute of the mission is logged in the Apollo archives. And it appears that what must have happened is that 3 of the astronauts must have needed to have gotten their suits on for the other one to go outside.
Right, so he's supposed to have climbed out of the command module.
Right.
This is this tiny little module that the 3 astronauts
It's sort of conical shape
are in.
Yes.
So the door, they're halfway back to the Earth, and that door's been opened.
Yes. I mean, that's my understanding of the system, and they've actually jettisoned the lunar module, the LEM, the lunar excursion. They've jettisoned that by that point, so I believe I checked that. So they've just got this very, very tiny space.
Right, so there's a connection between the outside space and the space in the craft that they're travelling in.
Yes, so that's
was it not always an airlock seal between, you know, the place that they go into another, like a buffer?
Not in the sense where there's not a large airlock that one of them could get into. There may be a small airlock at the top that, you know, you could fit a small amount of air in, but it's certainly not one that a person could get inside.
So if one of them was to get out into space, obviously they need to all put their spacesuits on, depressurize the cabin, and pressurize their spacesuits, so they're all sat there in the tiny craft with their whole spacesuits on.
And the one that goes outside has to put his backpack on. Maybe the others inside didn't need to do that because they were attached to some other air supply or something.
And then they've all got their spacesuits on because they can't open the door if one of them hasn't got their spacesuit on. So they open the door with these really difficult gloves. So they've got to open, go through the rigmarole of opening the door and climbing out while the others sit there. And you think that to get a spacesuit on, you actually need help from a third party?
I think so. I mean, again, we've got this video of James Burke, which we're going to show, dressing himself up in one of the suits or undressing himself, and he has 2 people helping him, and it's not a confined space. So, you know, my question is, how would this have been possible to actually do this? And you know, you can go and watch the video of the spacewalk and the video of James Burke, you know, doing the spacesuit undress.
So the question arises then, okay, let's say the mission's hoaxed. Why would they bother saying that one of them climbed out halfway back to get some tapes? Why would they bother doing that?
I can only imagine it was to add interest to the coverage, you know, because people were a bit bored of these taxi journeys to the moon and back. You know, okay, I've just been to the shops in my taxi, what's interesting about that? So they had to put some type of incident with, you know, some sort of potential risk in there to keep the viewership interested by that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, anyone who's got any comments, because I know that, as I said at the beginning, it's a very hot potato, and there are people who will cling to the official story.
You know, and we do have some good comments coming in, as we've said with the other programs we've done. And for example, somebody wrote to me fairly recently because I'd mentioned the Wernher von Braun description of how you'd need a rocket which was 10 times bigger than Apollo. It's in his book, Conquest of the Moon, 1953. And this chap did say, and I think rightly said, that he was called Carl, and he said the von Braun's scheme for getting to the moon was different to the one that they used, you know, and they didn't land. They landed a small rocket on the moon, whereas von Braun's scheme, they were going to land a sort of full-size rocket on the moon to get back. So he pointed out that it wasn't really fair to make those statements in quite that way, because that wasn't exactly the scenario that NASA allegedly used. In the end, it was different to the scheme that von Braun used. But you know, he still, this chap Carl, he said he still thought that they did hoax it. You know, he didn't believe that that von Braun thing was you know, the proof that they did go kind of thing. You know.
And just to mention that the audience is the most